You know, we think of our DNA as this code that makes us who we are, but what if it could also predict the future? Well, that's exactly what we're digging into today. We're looking at a pretty groundbreaking study that uncovered a hidden genetic clue, a clue that can forecast where a common blood cancer is headed long before it has a chance to turn deadly. I mean, it's a terrifying question, right? For thousands of patients and for doctors, it's been this long-standing mystery. You have someone who's living for years with a cancer that's considered slow-growing, totally manageable, and then, suddenly, it just transforms. It becomes this aggressive, life-threatening disease. And for so long, nobody knew why. Nobody knew who was at risk. Well, that might be changing.
The cancer at the heart of this story is called follicular lymphoma. Now, this is one of the most common blood cancers out there, and for most people, it's what's called an indolent disease, which really just means it's slow-growing and can often be managed pretty effectively over a long time.
But here's the thing. Here is the number that matters. For up to 15% of patients, that manageable diagnosis doesn't stick. Their cancer goes through what's called a histologic transformation, and that means, on a cellular level, it literally morphs into a much, much more aggressive and dangerous type of lymphoma. And that, right there, has been the central problem. Doctors just had no reliable way of knowing which of their patients would fall into that 15%. This created this huge unmet need, as they call it in the clinic. They desperately needed a way to predict this transformation before it actually happened.
So how do you solve a mystery that's written in our own biology? Well, you go straight to the source code. Scientists decided to hunt for clues where the cancer couldn't possibly hide its intentions, right there in the patient's DNA.
The strategy was, in concept, brilliantly simple. They decided to compare the genetic blueprint of the original slow-growing cancer, the follicular lymphoma, or FL, with the aggressive cancer it turns into, which is called diffuse large B-cell lymphoma, or DLBCL. The whole goal was to spot the differences, to find the genetic smoking gun.
And here's a peek at how they did it. First, they did whole-genome sequencing, which is basically reading every single letter of the tumor's DNA on hundreds and hundreds of samples. Then they fed all of this incredibly complex data to a machine learning model. Think of it like a digital detective that's been trained to find patterns that are just impossible for the human eye to see.
And guess what? That digital detective found something revolutionary. It wasn't just a single clue. It was a discovery that fundamentally rewrites what we even thought this cancer was. Okay, this is the core finding right here. What doctors had been calling follicular lymphoma for decades, turns out it isn't one single disease at all. Genetically speaking, it was actually two distinct subtypes, and each one had a very, very different destiny.
They gave them names CFL for constrained follicular lymphoma and DFL for DLBCL-like follicular lymphoma. And honestly, the names tell you everything you need to know. The constrained type has a low risk of transforming, while the DLBCL-like type, well, it's already on a genetic path to becoming way more aggressive.
So what are these specific genetic fingerprints that give them away? Well, the low-risk CFL tumors, they were defined by these very specific mutations in a gene called CREBBP, and overall they just had a more stable genome. The high-risk DFL tumors, on the other hand, showed signs of widespread genetic chaos. They already looked a lot like the aggressive cancer they were destined to become.
So, okay, it's a fascinating scientific discovery for sure. But the real question is, does this new classification system actually work? Can it predict the future for real patients?
Oh yeah, when the researchers tested their model on a whole different group of patients, the results were just stark. Patients whose cancer did eventually transform were overwhelmingly classified as the high-risk DFL subtype, right from their very first diagnosis. The low-risk CFL patients, they almost never transformed.
This quote from the study is what really drives the point home. It's not just about if a tumor transforms, it's about when. Patients with that high-risk DFL subtype transformed, on average, a full decade earlier than the very few CFL patients who ever transformed at all. A 10-year difference, that's huge.
Just stop and visualize that for a second. That massive gap in time. That represents years of life. It represents a completely different journey with the disease. It's the difference between long-term watchful management and an urgent, aggressive fight. And now, for the very first time, we might be able to predict that difference. So this is way more than just some academic breakthrough. This discovery really has the potential to change how this cancer is managed from day one. So why does all this matter for patients and doctors out there in the real world?
Well, first and most important, it means way better risk prediction. For the first time, doctors can sit down with the patient and give them a much clearer picture of their specific risk. And that leads to personalized care. A high-risk DFL patient might get more frequent scans, closer monitoring. A low-risk CFL patient could be spared all that extra anxiety and maybe some unnecessary procedures. And what's really exciting? It opens up brand new avenues for research to develop drugs that specifically target the genetic weaknesses of each subtype.
And that leaves us with a really powerful question to think about. We started with this medical mystery that was locked away inside our DNA. The answer wasn't just a single clue. It was a complete rewriting of the disease itself. It points to a future where maybe, just maybe, a single genetic test, right at the very beginning, could redefine everything that comes next.